From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Jan Lauritsen, Assistant Chief of the Music Division here in the Library of Congress. Welcome to today's lecture, sponsored jointly by the Music Division and the American Musicological Society. It's one in a series of lectures that was started in 2008 to highlight and publicize the work of AMS members who have conducted research in our collections. Today's speaker, Professor Carol Hess, worked extensively in one of our premier collections, the Aaron Copland collection. Today's lecture, as well as any astute, piercing questions or comments you have at the end, are all going to be recorded and webcast on the library's website. Here to introduce today's speaker is Christopher Reynolds, a professor of musicology at UC Davis and president of the American Musicological Society.
It's a pleasure to be in Coolidge Auditorium for a presentation by a distinguished member of the American Musicological Society. We are deeply grateful that the Music Division of the Library of Congress provides such support and resources for our scholars, welcoming them into its remarkable collections and providing such a lovely venue for them to present the fruits of their research to the public. Today I have the pleasure of introducing one of our distinguished members, Carol Hess, who will speak about her recent study of Aaron Copland and cultural interactions between the United States and Latin America. Twice the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, once to Spain and once to Argentina, Carol Hess is now Professor of Music at the University of California, Davis, and it gives me particular pleasure to say that because that makes her my colleague. She is an uncommonly prolific and wide-ranging scholar who launched her career with a book on the Spanish composer Manuel de Falla, a book which won 4 awards, including the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award and the Robert Stevenson Prize presented by the American Musicological Society for outstanding scholarship in Iberian music. Professor Hess's work engages sweeping questions about music, identity, and the way we think about music history. Yet it does so in ways that are solidly grounded in historical detail and that are attentive to the many different perspectives between North and South American musicians, critics, and government officials. Coming closer to the issues of today's lecture, Carol's third book, Representing the Good Neighbor, Music Difference in the Pan-American Dream, is changing the way we think about music historiography, not just in the Americas, but generally, because of the attention she pays to the historical context of our Latin American relations. Rather than focusing on differences between music composed in the United States and Latin America in the mid-20th century, Carol considers the numerous areas of shared musical values. Today, Professor Hess will lecture on Copland as Good Neighbor. Please join me in welcoming Carol Hess.
Thank you, Professor Reynolds. I'd also like to thank the efficient and good-humored staff of the Performing Arts Reading Room at the Library of Congress, the Music Division, the Copland Fund for granting permission for some of the images you're about to see, the National Endowment for the Humanities for funding my work in the Copland collection, Catholic University, which has also hosted me during this visit to Washington, the Hispanic Cultural Society, Songs of America, and of course, the American Musicological Society for making these lectures possible. In March 1933, when Hitler had been in power for just 6 weeks, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his inaugural address. Fascism loomed, European markets threatened to dry up, and it seemed that the world might once again stumble into war. The Americas had to unite. Accordingly, President Roosevelt explained his concept of the good neighbor, one who resolutely respects himself, and because he does so, respects the rights of others. The neighbor who respects his obligations and respects the sanctity of his agreements in and with a world of neighbors. Weeks later, on April 14th, then known as Pan American Day, the president elaborated further, alluding to effective bonds among the Americas. Your Pan-Americanism and mine, he declared, finds its source and being in the hearts of men and dwells in the temple of the intellect. In fact, Pan-Americanism, the idea that the Americas are bound by geography, common interests, and a shared history, had existed for over 100 years. Since the early 19th century, when both the Monroe Doctrine and Simón Bolívar's vision of pan-Latin American unity were crafted, North-South relations had been anything but harmonious, however. But on the eve of World War II, President Roosevelt gave Pan-Americanism new life through the Good Neighbor policy, a series of economic, commercial, and cultural initiatives intended to promote hemispheric solidarity. It's the cultural dimension of the Good Neighbor policy that interests us today as we look at the career of the U.S. composer Aaron Copland. Today, Copland is well known to concert audiences, to dance aficionados. In 1944, his ballet Appalachian Spring premiered in this very auditorium, and to movie buffs for his numerous film scores, and to readers of his various books and essays on music. Recently, however, musicologists have begun to assess his activities in cultural diplomacy, a pursuit the United States took especially seriously from mid-century on. Between 1941 and 1978, Copland made 13 government-sponsored tours in which he met composers from other countries and performed his own works along with those of other U.S. composers. As such, he practiced soft power. That is, his various activities suggested that the U.S. could be as viable a cultural presence as it was an economic and military one. Musicologists working on Copland's cultural diplomacy have largely concentrated on the East-West divide after the war, tracking the composer's visits to West Germany, or the former Soviet Union, for example. Yet it was during the Good Neighbor period that cultural diplomacy in the United States was officially launched. As we'll see when we begin examining the materials from the Aaron Copland collection of the Library of Congress, Copland was the right man at the right time. Prior to 1938, when the Division of Cultural Relations was established, cultural diplomacy was more or less an ad hoc operation in the United States. But in the 1930s, it took on new urgency, and Latin America proved a testing ground, with one cultural official remarking, "The door seemed open wider in Latin America than elsewhere." Of course, the very concept of cultural diplomacy raises questions. Is it primarily the endeavor to unite diverse peoples through deeply felt experiences of art? Is it the means by which one country promotes to other nations, or perhaps tries to impose upon them, its own cultural values? Such matters are especially compelling when we consider them in terms of music, a non-representational art that in most instances lacks explicit significance. Nonetheless, listeners are quick to attach meaning to musical works, meanings that may vary from one nation-state, region, or political constituency to another. In short, the adage, "music is the universal language," widely proclaimed by performers, music appreciation teachers, and government officials, is tested whenever musicians take up the duties of cultural diplomacy. How did the engineers of the Good Neighbor policy convince others of what would come to be known as Western Hemisphere culture? For one thing, they built on the fact that in the aftermath of World War I, when Europe lay in ruins, many artists and intellectuals in the United States were eager to separate themselves from the old world. These individuals articulated certain creation myths that they believed to apply to the Western Hemisphere. Newness, freshness, a tabula rasa in comparison with exhausted Europe. Nicholas Murray Butler, president of Columbia University, urged U.S. Americans to study Spanish. In 1917, the American Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese was founded. In the 1920s, at the University of California at Berkeley, Professor Herbert E. Bolton formulated what he called a fresh new pedagogy of U.S. history, in which he stressed the unity of the Americas by expanding the creation story of the United States beyond the New England colonies to include Spanish-speaking territories. Outside of academia, so-called Mayan architecture was popular. The New York Times hailed it as, quote, a new style which will be in every sense of the word indigenous in the New World. The Mayans themselves were proclaimed as the Greeks of the New World. And intellectuals such as author Waldo Frank waxed euphoric about the freshness of the Americas. Indeed, the word freshness surfaces repeatedly. Under Roosevelt, Pan-Americanism, now packaged as the Good Neighbor policy, reached unprecedented popularity, undergirded as it was by an intricate network of government, business, and technological interests. That such networks affected culture, often popular culture, emerges in the 1933 movie Flying Down to Rio. RKO produced the film with Pan American Airways, then the only airline flying to South America, and on whose board of directors Marion Cooper, the production chief of RKO, sat. The high-stepping dance on the wings of the airline's Yankee Clipper fleet against the backdrop of Rio de Janeiro's Sugarloaf Mountain displays wholesome American energy and technological prowess. The movie was also noteworthy in that its creators acknowledged that Portuguese, not Spanish, is spoken in Brazil, something you couldn't always take for granted in Hollywood. Shortly after Flying Down to Rio was released, Pan Am devoted its April 1933 bulletin to marketing travel in South America, which in turn prepared the Roosevelt administration to promote tourism at the Pan American Conference in Montevideo later that year, a perfectly safe topic, as Roosevelt told Secretary of State Cordell Hull. At that same conference, the United States also promised to stop intervening in Latin American governments, a practice that had long poisoned hemispheric relations. As for music, the highlight of Flying Down to Rio is a flashy dance number with generic Latin rhythms. It's all led by Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. It was their first on-screen pairing, and I hope to write about that someday. The point is that government, business, and culture in various forms all joined in the celebration of hemispheric harmony. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and World War II began. A special entity was formed to target North-South relations and to counter Nazi propaganda in the hemisphere, the Office for the Coordination of Commercial and Cultural Relations between the American Republics. This mouthful of a name was eventually shortened to the Office of Inter-American Affairs, or OIAA. Its leader was the energetic Nelson A. Rockefeller, son of John D. and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, and well-connected in business and philanthropic circles. These associations proved essential to the workings of the OIAA, which boasted 59 separate committees and a generous budget, $3.5 million in its first year, and a staggering $38 million in its second. In other words, Congress believed that it was important to allocate funds to send musicians, architects, writers, actors, and ballet dancers to South America. Another detail was the fact that Rockefeller was a Republican in a Democratic administration, suggesting an environment of, dare I say it, bipartisanship. Charged with promoting a Western Hemisphere identity distinct from Europe, the cultural wing of the OIAA now set about persuading Latin Americans to reject the influence of Paris, Vienna, or Berlin and embrace a shared culture of the Americas. This was no small challenge. Most educated Latin Americans had defined themselves in relation to Europe. acknowledging a history of violence and oppression with the mother countries, Spain and Portugal, but a wealth of cultural riches, especially from France. Further, many of these Latin American elites believed that U.S. culture simply did not exist. Well, maybe it did exist, but if so, it amounted to nothing but Westerns and jazz. U.S. cultural officials, however, believed that hemispheric political solidarity had a greater chance if a case could be made for cultural bonds. Accordingly, the OIAA awarded a Pan American Novel Prize, which NBC covered in a special radio broadcast on Pan American Day in 1941. Thanks to the OIAA's motion picture division, Hollywood served up a variety of timely films, ranging from documentaries such as Our Neighbors Down the Road to Walt Disney's animated features, Saludos Amigos, and The Three Caballeros, and a spate of movie musicals that, like Flying Down to Rio, capitalized on the Latin dance craze in the United States, and for which a bilingual Cuban-born consultant named Alison Durland was hired to edit out the stereotypes that had long offended Latin Americans. To be sure, such projects were not without complications. In 1942, Orson Welles began shooting a film about Carnival in Rio de Janeiro, which was shelved because it was felt that he dwelt at too great a length on impoverished Afro-Brazilians, dark-skinned peoples, as one commentator put it, living in the favelas, or hillside shantytowns. Also, during goodwill tours, a central ritual of the Good Neighbor policy, not all U.S. visitors to Latin America gave the right impression, as was the case with Douglas Fairbanks, Jr., who evidently made some rather untoward remarks to the media. As a result of these missteps, Waldo Frank caused a murmur of approval in the Spanish-language press during his goodwill tour, simply because he opened one of his lectures with the words, "I have come here to learn." That is, he would absorb what Latin Americans had to offer rather than tell them what to do. What about music? The OIAA's Music Committee was formed to promote a better understanding of the peoples of the various Latin American countries by us here in the United States through the medium of music in all its forms. Its chair was the musicologist and chief of the music division of the New York Public Library, Carlton Sprague Smith. The committee, whose minutes are found in the Copland collection, generally met in New York. Other members were Marshall Bartholomew, director of the Yale Glee Club, Walter Berrien, advisor on Latin American studies to the American Council of Learned Societies, and Evans Clark of the 20th Century Foundation, along with Copland himself. Others came and went, such as Davidson Taylor, assistant to the vice president of CBS, Philip Barber of NBC, and Gustavo Duran, a Spanish expatriate who, in addition to being a composer and specialist in folk music, had served as a lieutenant colonel during the Spanish Civil War on behalf of the Loyalists, that is, the government on which the Roosevelt administration had turned its back. Collaborating with business, private foundations, community organizations, and the Musicians Union, the OIAA Music Committee approved composition contests and radio broadcasts. It helped organize music education exchange projects, thanks to which Brazilian composer Francisco Mignone found himself conducting the Elkhart, Indiana High School Band at the 1942 meeting of the Music Educators National Convention. Copland was involved at the ground level, especially when it came to evaluating compositions. Suddenly, imbued with Pan-Americanist spirit, U.S. composers courted the committee. For example, when one Clough Leiter requested funds to distribute his Christ of the Andes Symphony in Latin America, alas, the committee judged the work unworthy. Committee members also advised on goodwill tours, now to include composers and performers of art music, and by this I mean classical or concert music. The committee also determined which Latin American art music composers should come to the United States. To be sure, some in the general public accused the Music Committee of snobbery. On 17 November 1940, an editorial in the New York-based Sunday Mirror appeared under the pseudonym Candide. As Candide complained, the Music Committee was composed of one musicologist, one chairman of the music department at Yale, one executive director of the 20th Century Fund, one lofty composer, and one gentleman from the American Council of Learned Societies. The fault we find is simply this: get down to earth. You can't lick only human nature, Mr. Rockefeller. We wish you had appointed to your music committee only leaders of America's dance orchestras, and perhaps made Bing Crosby and Ethel Merman co-chairman. Of course, the lofty composer was Copland. Let's not even comment on the scare quotes surrounding the dubious profession of musicology. True to his literary prototype, Candide perhaps exaggerated. Although the Music Committee was oriented toward art music, it did at least consider the possibility of a tour by Benny Goodman, a project that never came to fruition, however. Committee member Evans Clark argued vehemently on behalf of Latin American popular music, believing that, except insofar as composers of concert music make use of local themes and rhythms, their music tends to be an entirely individual expression in a sort of international, usually European musical language, and therefore it would be undeserving of support. In practice, the Music Committee valued not only art music that communicated Pan-American identity, but music that was also accessible to a broad public. While negotiating a project intended to commission works by Latin American composers for performance in the United States, Arthur Loesser of the Cleveland Institute of Music gave some advice to Latin American composers seeking such commissions. He wrote in a letter to the committee, "South American rhythms are swell, and Indian percussion instruments are fine, provided they are not too hard for our boys to learn how to play. But webs of atonal, dissonant counterpoint are definitely out. Nothing remotely resembling Hindemith, Schoenberg, Post-Sacro Stravinsky, or Bartók will do." Here I am not speaking as myself, but as a representative citizen of a fairly progressive Middle Western large city. When I give this talk in the Midwest, I always get a laugh at that point, I guess. Loesser also urges composers to distinguish their works from European models, writing, "The titles of the compositions are important. Variations on an original theme is not particularly calculated to arouse an interest in South America. But a title like Anaconda or Commodore Rivadavia is intriguing and will start a burgeoning of program notes with consequent fixation of attention." Now, I want to be clear that Arthur Loesser was not a member of the OIAA committee. In fact, he was the brother of the musical theater composer Frank Loesser. Whereas Arthur was witty and charming, as we can perhaps see from these excerpts, Frank was apparently rather nasty. In fact, Frank was known as the evil of two Loessers. Yet, Arthur's ideas about what kind of Latin American art music would be the surest carrier of hemispheric solidarity were exactly what the Music Committee promoted. Let's think back for a moment to the creation myths of Pan-Americanism that we've just mentioned. Newness, the tabula rasa, and that ubiquitous freshness. It isn't hard to relate these to music. In describing recent works by US or Latin American composers, the trope of freshness could easily prevail. Unlike a familiar Beethoven symphony, say, such works could be tagged as products of the tabula rasa. If they involved folklore, national or regional dances, melodies, or rhythms, the difference with Europe was even more explicit. As we'll see, this question of identity was especially meaningful to Copland, who privileged folklore both in his own compositions and in those of his Latin American colleagues, all to assert a music of the hemisphere distinct from Europe. As it turned out, however, Latin American composers themselves were by no means agreed on folklore, mainly because many associated it with 19th century musical nationalism and thereby found it old-fashioned. Wishing to be taken seriously by the international avant-garde, by the first world, these composers pursued the sort of modernism that Loesser believed was definitely out. All these issues, folklore, identity, musical modernism, surface in Copland's 1941 Goodwill Tour. He was charged to study contemporary Latin American music, to lecture on American music, and to conduct concerts of American music in several Latin American countries. He was also asked to return with a list of composers and musical scholars who are first-rate and who ought to be given funds to come to the United States for musical purposes. Copland was the logical choice for such a tour. He spoke Spanish fairly well and could at least read and pronounce Portuguese. He was interested in Latin America, especially Mexico, first visiting there in 1932 and composing his popular orchestral work, El Salón México, as a souvenir. Here's a sample of that famous work, which, as you might imagine, uses folk tunes. Not only that, but a good 5 years before Roosevelt's Good Neighbor speech, Copland had advocated the idea of a music unique to the Western Hemisphere, especially praising works by the Mexican composer Carlos Chávez. Copland believed that the freshness of Chávez's works would stand up to European music, with which Copland was becoming disillusioned. In 1931, he even complained to Chávez, "Carlos, I've had it with Europe. Carlos, estoy harto de Europa." More important, Copland was aesthetically in sync with the OIAA Music Committee. Before El Salón México, he had distinguished himself as a modernist in works such as the piano variations from 1930. And here's a sample of the piano variations, Copland's modernist period. Shortly after he composed the piano variations, however, Copland decided to renounce the rarefied world of the avant-garde and express himself in the simplest possible terms, as he put it in his book, Our New Music, which appeared just before he left for Latin America. Accordingly, he composed not only El Salón México, but the ballet Billy the Kid, into which Copland inserts cowboy songs. To be sure, with this populist stance, Copland guaranteed that some critics and composers would accuse him of selling out, of pandering to the masses. The committee gave Copland a stipend of $3,100, which was to last him for all 4 months in Latin America. He was instructed to buy health and accident insurance from these monies. He kept a diary of his experiences. I understand the diary is on display in the glass case outside in the lobby. From this diary, he was able to write a 45-page report from the State Department at the end of his trip. Today, I'd like to focus on those diary entries that most compellingly reveal the priorities, the successes, and the missteps of U.S. cultural diplomacy with Latin America during World War II. In fact, Copland kept diaries for a total of 6 trips he made to Latin America between 1941 and 1963. And since they've never been analyzed, I'm presently completing an annotated edition of them, describing the composers he met, explaining Latin American genres or other phenomena that may be unfamiliar to readers in the United States. My goal is that my readers see Latin American music through Copland's eyes over this 20-year period. I mention this not so much as to plug my book, but to urge that we, as a musical public, reconsider some of the priorities of musical good neighborliness, most of which, in fact, atrophied during the Cold War and after. For example, between 1987 and 1997, the 500-plus concerts given by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra included exactly 1 work by a Latin American. Until just recently, students in undergraduate music history classes would begin studying music of the United States with psalm singing in colonial New England, thus eliminating Gregorian chant, for example, sung in what is now Texas. Given that the Latino population in the United States reached 16% in 2010 and is projected to figure at 29% by 2050, it would seem only appropriate to revisit that fleeting moment, the good neighbor period, when Latin American art music mattered in the United States. As we explore some of Copland's diaries from 1941, we'll also consult other documents related to Latin America found in the Library of Congress, such as correspondence and press reviews, which you'll see transcribed on my slides. On August 19, 1941, at 7:15 p.m., Copland left New York's Idlewild Airport, arriving the next morning in Brownsville, Texas, on the northern bank of the Rio Grande. After a short layover, the Good Neighbor Policy's representative for art music arrived in Mexico City, where he renewed old friendships and met with various Mexican composers. Then he set off for less familiar territory. Throughout, Copland flew Panagra, a subsidiary of Pan Am. And this picture is also on display outside. What cultural values would Copland's own music suggest to Latin American critics? How attractive would these values prove, and would they further the Good Neighbor Policy? Throughout the 1941 trip, critics reviewing his music consistently observed optimism, realism, dynamism, vigor, and especially freshness, frescura, in both Spanish and Portuguese, all terms that echoed basic Pan-Americanist principles. Such values conquered the musical public of Lima, for example, where Copland conducted Billy the Kid in its full ballet version. Now, ballet might not have seemed one of the U.S.'s strongest cards to play in cultural diplomacy. After all, many in the United States felt keenly the lack of a national school of dance, despite the efforts of Isadora Duncan and Martha Graham. Incidentally, Graham, who choreographed Appalachian Spring, was also moved by good neighborliness in that she choreographed several scores by the Brazilian composer Heitor Villa-Lobos. Nevertheless, the OIAA funded a goodwill tour, or recommended funding for a goodwill tour of South America by the American Ballet Caravan, the company Lincoln Kirstein founded to showcase American works. Among them was Billy the Kid, El Chivato in Spanish, that tale of the American West. Peru was important to U.S. diplomatic and military efforts, given its Pacific coastline and capacity to produce fuel for aviation. Not all Peruvians, indeed not all Latin Americans, wished to take sides in the growing global conflict, however, believing that a U.S.-engineered war would generate additional tensions between Latin America and the so-called Colossus of the North. Of course, Copland was not expected to address such questions head-on. Rather, in pursuing soft power, he met various Peruvian composers and lectured at the Instituto Cultural Peruano Norteamericano, an event covered by at least 4 newspapers, with La Crónica publishing photos of the composer before an attentive audience. Of particular interest to the press was a novel technological enhancement, that is, the recordings Copland played during the talk, excerpts from Ives's Second Violin Sonata and Set for Theater Orchestra, Harris's Symphony No. 3, and Piston's Carnival Song. Copland also played his own Quiet City, which one reporter called a real gift. The next day, he conducted Billy the Kid. Even Kirstein acknowledged that Latin American audiences used to classical ballet might be unreceptive to all-American dance programs. For that reason, Billy was bookended by Die Fledermaus by Johann Strauss Jr. and Imperial Ballet on Tchaikovsky's Second Piano Concerto. What would the Lima public make of a ballet based on the Wild West, that symbol of U.S. energy, aggression, entrepreneurship, or imperialism, depending on your point of view? In fact, Lima's critics were much taken with Billy. One implied that the Western United States was as exotic to the Latin American public as the jungles of the Amazon or the swaying palms of the Caribbean were to U.S. audiences. Another critic preferred it outright to Die Fledermaus, declaring, "Billy the Kid transports us to an aesthetic scheme of much greater interest for the novelty of its choreographic conception, audaciously treating a theme that, in and of itself, would seem less than apt for a ballet." The same critic observed vigor and dynamism, multiple and deft touches of realism. In other words, unconventional, but identity-conscious subject matter surpassed on aesthetic grounds a European classic, largely through dynamism and vigor. To be sure, critics in other cities were less enthusiastic. Whereas Buenos Aires praised Copland's An Outdoor Overture for its freshness, critics there were underwhelmed by Billy. The same was true of Rio de Janeiro, which, like Buenos Aires, was an important diplomatic target given the strong presence of Axis sympathizers. Yet it is impossible to know if this tepid reaction was politically motivated. Nazi newspapers, such as El Pampero in Argentina, for example, could hardly be expected to enthuse over American vigor or dynamism. Or possibly substandard performances were to blame, since, as Kirstein complained, orchestras were not always up to snuff. Clearly, Copland's presence on the podium in Lima also struck a blow for U.S. culture. What about that other marker of U.S. culture, jazz? On September 15th, Copland left Peru for Santiago, Chile, where, among other activities, he would perform his own jazz-inflected piano concerto with the Orquesta Sinfónica de Chile under Armando Carvajal, and also conduct his outdoor overture, Quiet City, and El Salón Mexico. Here's an excerpt of the concerto. As a bit of advance publicity, Copland was interviewed by the Santiago daily Últimas Noticias. The interviewer, Chilean composer and critic Pablo Garrido, was passionate about jazz. Garrido translated the famous 1934 book Le Jazz Hot by French critic Hugh Panassier into Spanish, and also established the Club de Hot Jazz, the Hot Jazz Club de Chile. Garrido's enthusiasm so overwhelmed his meeting with Copland that the interview turned into an essay, Poor Copland Doesn't Get in a Word, amid Garrido's reflections on the social ramifications of jazz in the United States. Garrido's article also stands out in the Latin American press coverage of Copland's tour, in that it touches on the composer's politics. Garrido takes as a point of reference Copland's 1934 Workers' Chorus, Into the Streets May 1st, which, Garrido believes, placed Copland in direct contact with the very social classes that jazz represented. Garrido writes, right alongside Copland, without him being aware of it, runs the warm blood of hot jazz. Louis Armstrong and Coleman Hawkins and 100 anonymous figures with dark faces scrape out the song of the downtrodden with melodies and rhythms beyond anything we know, inspirations and improvisations of the moment in which one lives. Eventually, and without Copland being aware of it or being able to avoid it, Duke Ellington's band and the African jungle came to be mixed with the rivers, the trees, and the birds of the fields and the town. Aaron Copland is the magnificent result of this delirium and desire. Like all genuinely great men, Copland is extraordinarily simple. There is no pretension in his stance, his clothes, his speech. He extends his hand, receives, and greets everyone as an equal. Far from exuding vigor or freshness, jazz speaks for unnamed, marginalized African Americans, whose presence Copland exemplifies both in his music and in his comradely demeanor. As for the idea that cultural diplomacy could cross racial lines, inarticulate ambivalence reigned in the absence of policy, however. If Brazil was unwilling to display its dark-skinned peoples to Orson Welles, Copland too was aware of such tensions. When he met the Afro-Brazilian musicologist and critic Mario de Andrade in Sao Paulo, later in his 1941 tour, Copland acknowledged Andrade's impressive erudition and speculated as to whether to recommend him for an exchange visit, given, as Copland confided to his diary, the Negro problem to be considered, of course. As it turned out, the fact that Andrade spoke no English resolved the question. As for jazz in Chile, Copland, silenced during his so-called interview with Garrido, commented on the subject a few days later, this time in a real interview with another Santiago newspaper, La Opinión. Essentially, he distanced himself from jazz. To be sure, he acknowledged its power, but he makes it clear that for him, jazz had been but a first step. The first influence I received was of black music, the primordial origins of jazz that so impassioned the mass public in the United States. But since jazz is such a limited field, contained between the blues and swing so popular today, I had to get off this path by force. Today, I'm free of all outside influence and dedicate myself solely to pouring out my own ideas in relation, of course, to the world around me. Of course, we cannot know the extent to which Copland's remarks were edited. As to his freedom from outside influence, here he essentially asserted the well-tested tropes of newness and pristine originality, that is, the creation myth for the Americas. On the piano concerto itself, Santiago's critics were divided. One, writing in La Hora, observed that the concerto was, quote, the weakest of the works presented, noting a languor that tires the listener. Then there was the anonymous reporter for La Nación, who believed that jazz, and by extension Copland's concerto, bastardized rather than sublimated African American culture. The composer of the concerto for piano and orchestra writes music following the tendencies staked out by the race of color from his native land. But we believe that black music counts for its rustic and principally for its religious value. He's referring to spirituals. Not only that, but jazz failed to do honor both to the people it represented and to their spiritual forebears. Jazz is the blackest of black music, wrote this critic. It's music with neither backbone nor vital marrow. It's not the spirit of the poor North American black, of the cabin immortalized in a revolutionary novel that dignifies the colored race. In a parting shot, the same critic excoriates those who would exploit the music of the underclass, North or South, in either art music or in the popular realm. He writes, North American jazz and Argentine tango are the two tendencies that have done the greatest harm in the domain of art and in the immaculate field of the music of the people. In short, the Colossus of the North was hardly immune to poverty and inequality, the very problems that beset Latin America. As we can see, national identity was front and center in Latin American critics' perceptions of Copland, but the reverse was also true. Copland formed his opinions of Latin American composers largely in terms of their ability to resist European influence. Those too indebted to France, for example, were unlikely to win his approval. At the end of his trip, in December 1941, Copland jotted in his diary, "The French influence is predominant everywhere in music in South America." Spain and France exerted undue power as well, as was clear from the vast output of the Brazilian composer Heitor Villa-Lobos. Copland called Villa-Lobos the Manuel de Falla of Brazil on a good day, and the Ottorino Respighi, the Italian composer, on a bad one. According to Copland, Villa-Lobos marshaled a range of, quote, modern French processes of composition, such that his music is enormously picturesque at times, sometimes cheap and vulgar, sometimes astonishingly original. Tersely, Copland concluded, the Villa-Lobos music has one outstanding quality, abundance. That is its primary virtue. Indeed, as Copland noted in his diary, few Latin American composers really rose to the occasion. Some, like Chavez, tried their hand at indigenous music, but without much success. In Lima, Copland attended a rehearsal of the Conjunto Bacarno, a small ensemble that performed on harps, violins, panpipes, and various percussion instruments, more or less the Andean music so widely marketed today. Someday, Copland speculated, some Peruvian composer will be able to recreate this music in a symphonic form. No one, to my knowledge, has done it yet. As for folk music, Copland praised the efforts of Argentine composer Alberto Ginastera. Ginastera, by the way, received funding and various prizes from the Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge Foundation. On Ginastera, Copland observed, so far, at any rate, Ginastera is not a heavyweight. He has a pleasant talent, a sure hand at orchestration, and a knack for writing effective, surefire music. It is sympathetic rather than impressive, with the usual French-Spanish bias, and a natural flair for Argentinian musical phraseology. Here, Copland was probably referring to the in-progress nationalist ballet Estancia, which takes as its inspiration the world of the gaucho, or errant horsemen of the vast Argentine pampas. It remains one of Ginastera's most recorded works. Well, as I mentioned earlier, any number of Latin American composers could have cared less about folklore. Havana-based composer José Ardevol wrote sonatas and concerti grossi and urged his large class of students to emulate European traditions and thus avoid the stigma of localismo. This was also the viewpoint of the well-traveled Guillermo Uribe Holguín of Colombia, whom Copland met in Bogotá. Uribe Holguín had studied in Paris and throughout his long career rejected folklore. He argued, music knows no country, and he disparaged Colombian folk music, which he believed could be, quote, reduced to a handful of dance pieces characterized by their rhythms. To be sure, in employing a universal musical language, Uribe Holguín was accused of rejecting his own roots. One especially hardcore anti-folklorist was the Argentine composer Juan Carlos Paz, whom Copland met in Buenos Aires. There, the OIAA's message of musical Americanism proved a hard sell, since many Argentines prided themselves on their cosmopolitanism, with some unabashedly dubbing Buenos Aires the Paris of Latin America. Paz tried his hand at several styles, late Romantic chromaticism, neoclassicism, before becoming the first composer in Latin America to practice serialism, which is the method formulated by the German composer Arnold Schoenberg, according to which all 12 notes of the chromatic scale are equalized. That obliterates any perceptions of dissonance and consonance. A fine pianist, Paz performed serial music in Buenos Aires, and in 1937, his Passacaglia for orchestra was performed in Paris, the first serial work by a Latin American to be played abroad. Here's a sample of Paz's music, clearly in a different world from Ginastera's rollicking gaucho dance. More than one, Paz expressed himself on folklore. In 1940, he declared in the journal Modern Music, which was published in New York, when the Argentine composer tries to be national and invokes the easy folklore of Argentina, his language seems dead, his folkloric style superficial, his creative impotence only too obvious and pathetic. This hard-hitting language emerges even more forcefully in Paz's music criticism, which caused him to be widely known and feared in Argentine musical circles. Those familiar with Paz's sharp tongue, however, will be surprised to read his correspondence with Copland prior to the 1941 trip. Not long before Copland's departure, the administrative staff of the OIAA sent Paz a copy of Copland's profoundly non-folkloric piano variations, the work we heard a moment ago in which so decisively established him as a modernist, that is, before he resolved to express himself in the simplest possible terms. In a letter of August 3rd, 1941, Paz addressed Copland as most dear friend, rather than the more formal distinguished sir of previous correspondence. He writes, "Thank you for your gracious letter of July 22nd and for the copy of your variations for piano, for which I am very thankful. I knew this stunning work from the Columbia recording in which it appears in your magisterial interpretation. Thus, without your knowing it, you were already in my studio, ready to delight me with a rendering of your work whenever I had the desire and the time to hear it." Then Paz offers Copland an appearance on the new music concert series he had recently established. In other words, impressed by the unflinching modernism of the piano variations, Paz was eager to assemble for Copland an audience of peers, above and beyond the broader public envisioned by the OIAA. Certainly Paz knew and disliked El Salón Mexico and Billy the Kid, but in 1941, he kept a discreet silence on Copland the Populist to welcome Copland the Modernist. It's not hard to imagine, therefore, Paz's reaction to Copland's article, The Composers of South America, which also appeared in the journal Modern Music just weeks after Copland returned to the States. In it, Copland abruptly sheds the role of cultural diplomat to become a critic. Indeed, we might almost surmise that unlike Waldo Frank, who went to Latin America to learn, Copland went to teach. Acknowledging a handful of potentially fine composers, among them Ginastera, and citing difficulties of education and infrastructure under which Latin American composers labor, Copland notes that of the 65 composers he met, he failed, quote, to find a Bach or a Beethoven among them. He also warns readers who, quote, thrive exclusively on masterpieces to stay away from Latin American music, although to be sure, he adds that those receptive to future potential may well be rewarded. Copland also reiterates his conviction that, quote, the countries that have developed most quickly are those with the richest folklore. Then he enumerates, country by country, the consequences of Latin American composers avoiding their folklore. For example, Copland found that Chilean music was not as fresh as it might be. With uncharacteristic bluntness, he devoted an entire paragraph to Villalobos's defects, taken verbatim from his diary, which I've just summarized. He adds that in Peru and Colombia, only two composers, Uribe Holguín and Andrés Sass, were, quote, worth serious consideration. With regard to Paz, Copland praised his Argentine colleague's formidable intellect and work ethic, but he also informed the U.S. musical public that Paz's, quote, attachment to the Schoenberg line was mental rather than emotional, and that his music was as cool and detached and precise as any diagram, the kind of music that is always a pleasure to look at, if not always a pleasure to hear. It is difficult to know how Copland imagined his article would be received in Latin America. Perhaps he believed Latin Americans were unfamiliar with the international musical press, or that they did not read English. Nor is it clear why he did not fulfill his charge to identify candidates for visits to the United States less publicly. In Buenos Aires, at any rate, there were repercussions. In May 1942, one of Ginastera's symphonies premiered there, and Paz, true to form, lambasted it in a review. Various and sundry stepped in on Ginastera's behalf, such that the normally mild-mannered Ginastera himself entered the fray. His principal defense? Copland's Modern Music article. How right Copland is, Ginastera declared in a written response. Paz's manner of composing is like solving a crossword puzzle or an anagram. Mix the 12 tones among themselves, coldly, like a calculator. In 1952, Paz published a book, La Música en los Estados Unidos, Music in the United States, one of few by a Latin American on that subject. In it, Paz accused Copland of, quote, susceptibility to the law of supply and demand. He also called El Salón Mexico, quote, the limit of sentimentalized conformity and folkloric banality. Of course, by that time, the Cold War had begun, and a new enemy threatened the hemisphere, communism. The United States returned to the hated practice of interventionism, supporting right-wing Latin American dictators unfriendly to communism, and with the aid of the newly established CIA, sometimes toppling governments seen as leftist, as in Guatemala in 1953 and in Chile 20 years later. As for cultural diplomacy in Latin America, State Department programs now expanded to other regions, such as the Far East and Soviet bloc countries, such that Latin America was but one element of a global project. Copland pursued cultural understanding in the region, however. In 1947, he returned to Latin America, visiting Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. In 1962, he went to Brazil, Mexico, and Uruguay. And in 1963, to Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Colombia, each time with government support. By then, folkloric nationalism was increasingly associated with communism. Indeed, in government and the press, the very term nationalism was often equated with anti-US left-leaning sentiment. Serialism, seen as neutral with respect to national identity, became ever more attractive. Copland himself took it up, a shift some scholars have connected with his desire to distance himself from communism. As you may know, in 1953, Copland appeared before a Senate subcommittee of the House Un-American Activities Committee, as did so many artists and intellectuals involved in liberal politics, however peripherally, during the Great Depression. The idea of a folk-tinged art music redolent of the Western Hemisphere had thus proved ephemeral. On balance, Copland received high marks from the Latin American press as he went about the often exhausting tasks cultural diplomacy demands: interviews, radio and television broadcasts, lectures, and the endless round of embassy functions and small talk, along with musical performances, all in a foreign language. Perhaps because he was never again as outspoken as he was in the Modern Music article, the great majority of his Latin American colleagues applauded his efforts. For example, the Chilean composer Juan Salas remarked that Copland's interest in Latin America went beyond just a good neighbor policy. Yet in the late 1980s, Copland himself remarked in an interview that he and others had once believed, quote, that the history of 20th century music was going to be written from both North and South America, adding, in hindsight, perhaps we were naive. Given the indifference I described earlier to Latin American art music by U.S. performing ensembles, to the Spanish colonial presence in the study of U.S. history, musical and otherwise, we might be inclined to agree with Copland's rather bleak assessment. Yet perhaps the hindsight we now possess can stimulate us to return to the positive features of the Good Neighbor period. We can at least agree that composers who successfully proved themselves before an international public in the 1930s and 40s deserve to appear on concert programs nowadays. We can see to it that their music is taught in college and university music departments and also written about. In reflecting on Copland's cultural diplomacy tour of 1941, we can decide to learn rather than teach. In short, as recent demographic trends alter the human landscape of the United States, we can practice cultural diplomacy here at home. There would seem to be little naivete in such an enterprise. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.